Knowing when to use the rear brake on a motorcycle is a funny thing. Ask 10 different riders about how they use the rear brake, and you're likely to get 10 different answers. The thing is, they could all be right, but they could also all be wrong. With this video, I'm going to dig into when and why to use the rear brake so you can best decide what's going to work for you. If you've taken any sort of riding class, you've probably heard the instructor say that braking is 70% front brake and 30% rear brake. They say it so matter-of-factly that you just take it for granted as being true. Real life, however, isn't so cut and dried. Yes, there are times when 70-30 applies, but there are also many times when it doesn't. Not knowing the difference can get you into trouble. The key to understanding when to use the rear brake is to know that it depends on the bike that you're riding and the conditions that you're riding in. What's best for one bike in one situation may not work at all for another bike in another condition. Despite what they may teach you at the riding safety course, there is no one-size-fits-all answer here. Let's start off by looking at some of the basics of braking on a motorcycle. When we're at speed and apply the brakes, a few things happen. First, more of the weight of the bike is transferred to the front wheel, which then depresses the front shock. Because more weight is transferred to the front wheel, that creates more downward force on the front tire, which then allows for more braking force to be applied before the tire skids. The friction between the slowing tires and the road surface then causes the bike to slow down. Because more weight is being shifted to the front of the bike, that means there is less weight on the back wheel. Less weight means that less braking force can be applied to the rear wheel before it begins to skid. In extreme braking situations, for example in motorcycle racing, the rear tire of the bike will actually completely lift from the ground due to the massive amount of braking force being applied by the riders as they fly into a corner. As you can imagine, there's not much point in using your rear brake if your rear tire isn't even touching the ground. It's because of this weight transfer that the front wheel will always provide more braking power than the rear. How much more is dependent on the design of the motorcycle. Specifically, how weight is distributed on the bike. The more weight that is placed to the rear of the bike, the more important and useful the rear brake becomes. The less weight in the rear, the less necessary the back brake. When you apply braking force to an unweighted wheel, you increase the chance of the wheel locking up and skidding on the pavement. Once your wheel locks up, the bike becomes destabilized and harder to handle. When you're flying into a slow corner or trying to evade a collision, the last thing you need is the rear tire of your bike skidding all over. What about ABS? Isn't that supposed to stop a skid so we don't have to worry about that? Yes, ABS will prevent a full-blown skid, but once it's activated, your tire still isn't fully gripping the asphalt like it would if it was freely rotating. Leave ABS for emergencies where you go all in. Before I get all kinds of comments correcting me, let me qualify this by saying that the information in this video applies to street riding, not dirt bike riding, where riders skid their wheels all the time. Yes, I know that pro racers will sometimes skid their rear wheel going through corners. However, since we're talking about street riding and we're all amateurs here, let's just agree that locking up your rear tire is a bad idea. So, the key to how much rear brake we will use depends on how likely we are to lock up the rear tire. The more weight in the back of the bike, the less likely it is to lock up. The more weight to the front, the more it's a problem we need to think about. Let's look at different styles of bikes and compare how they distribute their weight. If we put the various bikes on a continuum of how weight is distributed from rear to front, on one end we'll have choppers with a mile-long front fork and all their weight in the back. Then we'd have cruisers with their forward-angled shocks and riders seated further to the back. Next we'll have adventure, cafe, and sport touring bikes where the rider is planted more or less in the middle. Finally, we've got sport bikes where the weight is all to the front and nothing sits on the tail. Given that choppers have all their weight in the back, it's no surprise that many don't even have a front brake. It's all rear brake for them. If a rider says they never use their front brakes, they're probably on a chopper. Cruisers, especially the big baggers, also push the weight to the back. However, since they don't have the super long forks like a chopper, their weight is more evenly distributed between front and back. That being the case, using both the front and rear brakes becomes essential. When I'm riding my Indian Scout Cruiser, I apply both front and rear brakes more or less equally when I'm coming to a quick stop or slowing down for a corner. Even if I didn't want to use the rear brake, my Scout has only one relatively small disc up front, so there's not even enough braking power for the front brake to quickly stop the bike on its own. The Scout isn't alone here. You'll actually find only one disc up front on a lot of cruisers. Next up, we've got adventure, cafe racers, and sport touring bikes. Depending how you're riding them, you'll either use more or less rear brakes. If you got your bike loaded down with saddlebags and gear, then you're more likely to have weight on the rear wheel and be carrying more weight overall, so the rear brake becomes especially helpful, if not necessary. If, on the other hand, you're riding it empty and whipping it around like a sport bike, then you'll want to go heavier with the front brake and lighter on the back brake. How much you use will also depend on the geometry of your bike, how it's designed, and how capable your front brakes actually are. If it's more touring friendly, you'll use more back brake. More sporty, less back brake. Finally, we've got the zippy sport bikes. With little weight on the rear wheel and forward-leaning geometry, the rear tire will quickly lock up under moderate to hard braking. When I'm riding hard in the mountains or on the track, I never use my rear brake. I don't even touch it. If it completely disappeared, I'd barely notice it. I'm not alone here. Racers who brake far harder than any of us ever will don't touch it either. Professional racer Sylvain Giuntoli admitted that when he won the World Superbike Championship in 2014, he never once touched his rear brake all season. I'm including a link above where this former MotoGP racer goes into the details of hard braking at the track. Now, I can hear some of you protesting already and pounding away on your keyboards that MotoGP riders use their rear brakes all the time. Yes, they do. However, they use a handbrake on the left handlebar. They're not using the traditional foot pedal the way us mere mortals are forced to. Just try using the rear brake pedal during a hard braking corner and you'll quickly realize the futility of rear braking at speed. Yes, there may be advantages to using the rear brake mid-corner and on exit, for example if you have a 250 plus horsepower bike. However, that's way outside the scope of this video. The bottom line here is that if you can become a world champion without using the rear brake, I think the rest of us are just fine without it. You can see how this front brake versus rear brake question plays out on the bikes themselves. Let's compare the rear brakes on a sport bike versus those on a cruiser. You'd think the sport bike with its massive dual caliber front brakes would have a comparable rear brake. Instead, the rear brake disc is actually quite small. Meanwhile, the cruiser has a significantly larger back brake by comparison. Bottom line, this is a classic case of form meeting function. The cruiser gets a bigger brake because it needs it, while the sport bike gets a smaller one because it doesn't. Don't just take my word for all of this. I recommend that you take your bike to a parking lot and see at what point your rear tire will begin to skid when you're applying both front and rear brakes. Knowing just where your rear tire will lock up will help you get the most out of your brakes when you need them the most. Now, having said all that, there are times when all riders are best off using their rear brake. For example, when you're doing low-speed maneuvering, if you're making a tight U-turn, or coming to a slow but complete stop at a light. The rear brake offers more control and a softer touch. Using the front brake at slow speeds usually delivers too much force and destabilizes the bike. When you need subtle inputs at low speed, the back brake is your choice. There's one other situation when it's important to rely on that back brake. That's when you leave the pavement and hit the dirt. Whether by choice or by accident, once you leave the security of the pavement for the low traction of the dirt, the rear brake is your one and only friend. I'm no dirt riding pro here, so I'll keep this just at the basics. Once you're on the dirt, if you give that front brake too much pressure, you're likely to lock up the front wheel and lose the bike. Instead, gently apply the rear brake to slow your speed or come to a stop. So, how should you use your rear brake? Now you've got the answer. It all depends. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. If you have any stories or experience about using your rear brake, leave them in the comments below. As always, stay safe and enjoy the ride.